you all so much for coming. You guys are at the first panel on the first day of Theorizing the Web, which is a good sign. I think this is going to be a really good group. My name is Michael Connor. I'm here to moderate today. I'm editor and curator of Rhizome, which is a nanotechnology nonprofit based here in New York. 100% of our staff are sitting in the front row. But not 100% of the front row.
Do I need a job?
The title of today's panel is Tales from the Script, Infrastructures and Design. And I would say that this panel as a whole addresses power and its unequal distribution across networks, suggests different ways we can address this through systemic intervention and analysis. And there's a particular focus on code and on users in that address. So I want to just begin with a brief introduction of our four panelists. To my left is Karen Levy. Karen is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at Princeton University. Her research focuses on intersections of law, technology, and social life. Can you all hear me in the back, by the way? I don't know what the acoustics are like out there. Yeah? Yeah. All right. Karen's paper is entitled The Myth of the End User. We have next to her our Stuart Geiger, who is a computational ethnographer and PhD student at the UC Berkeley School of Information. And do you go by Stuart? Or
I go by Stuart, yeah.
Stuart's paper is titled Successor Systems, Enacting Ideological Critique through the Development of Software. So that would be more intervention into networks of power. Then we have Angela Kristen Vandenbroek. How'd I do? If I was really a Dutch speaker, that would be better. Excellent. It's the best way to come Dutch if you're not. Angela worked as a web designer and developer for 6 years after completing her MA in anthropology. Now she is a PhD student at Binghamton University, studying digital design and development in Sweden. She writes things for her blog, How to Be an Anthropologist, and her paper is titled Tweeting Sweden, Complicating Anthropology through the Analysis of the World's Most Democratic Twitter Account. Did these words correct here?
Very.
All right, good. And then at the end we have Sebastian Benthall, who is a cognitive scientist turned open source studio developer turned PM, turned PhD student at UC Berkeley School of Information. And those are a lot of different classes. And he's here today to tell you about designing digital publics for participatory parity. So there's an emphasis on design across a number of these projects. Just the kind of like logistics of this, we have a very limited window of time. So each person is going to get 12 to 15 minutes to present. At 9 minutes, I'm going to hold up my hand like this. At 12 minutes, I'm going to go like this. And then I'm going to cut you off like full stop at 15, because it's very important that we preserve time between the break for socializing off Twitter. But the last thing is to remind you that we are socializing on Twitter even as we're sitting here. I'm tweeting right now, participating in kind of like a cognitive discourse. But the hashtag for the panel is moderated by Annie Wang. Where is it, Annie Wang?
Over here.
Annie, what is the hashtag for this panel?
It is, the full hashtag is TTW14, but for this room specifically, you can add in a hashtag A1. And I will be the medium through which the internet will channel through me on Twitter. So tweet me questions or thoughts.
A1, catchy. I think we should go in the order of speakers that was listed in the program, and I think that puts Sebastian first. Oh, can I have that wrong?
Karen.
It's you? Karen is first. All right.
Sorry.
We'll let the read start.
That's the standard. I think we're sitting there.
Oh, you are?
Yep, you'll need to open it up there. Stuart's.
Is it already open?
It should be the left. Yeah, there.
Okay.
Karen, you're not on Twitter.
I'm not on Twitter.
What?
I know. I'm not on Twitter. So you'll have to either channel through Annie or just talk to me physically. So hi, everybody. I'm Karen. Thanks again, Michael, for the introduction, and to all of you for giving me a chance to throw out some ideas. Just so you know, as Michael said, most of my research is about relationships between technology and law in different social contexts, and most of that work has actually taken place in the context of the trucking industry is like my major research focus. So I'm not talking about trucking. Can you guys hear me? Is that a no? Okay, I'll remind me though if I, I'll just stand up too. So what I'm going to talk about today is not trucking. It's something I've never talked about before. It's a bit of an experiment for me, but I thought this was a good venue for experimentation. So thanks for bearing with me through the experiment. And what I want to talk with you about today is this idea of the end user. So I've been starting to think about this a lot lately in the context of trucking, and it just led me to think more generally. I feel like the idea that the user is central to design has become like really paramount. If you do anything around tech or design, you know, the idea of UX, user experience.
And your time.
Yeah, that was it. It's basically like a watchword of conscientious design to say that you're designing for the user. So we definitely know the user is important, but I'm not necessarily convinced that we know who the user is or what the user is. And so I want to explore that a little bit today. So the first thing I did when thinking about what the user is was perhaps, it's a little cliche, but I went to Wikipedia. Good place to start. And Wikipedia's definition of the end user is like supremely general and unhelpful. It just says, the end user of a product is a person who uses the product, and then it gives this unhelpful example, which is the end user of a pharmaceutical product is the patient who takes it. And that's relevant for the case that I'm going to talk about. That's why I put it up here. But I read Wikipedia, and then I started reading a bit in HCI and STS, and I noticed that even more sophisticated conceptions of the end user tend to usually refer to the end user either explicitly or implicitly as an individual. And so what I want to suggest today is that that's just like a fundamentally incomplete definition of the end user, and if we really want to design for end users, we need to think of end users not as individuals, but as networks. So last winter, I got really sick. I had like this horrible head cold for about 3 months. I was just like this huge ball of snot. And so I went to the Rite Aid by my house to buy some Sudafed, which I bought before, and which I know really helps when you're sick. And those of you who've bought, well, actually, I guess not everyone's from New York, but in New York and in actually 41 other states, to buy Sudafed, if you've bought Sudafed in the last 10 years, you know that you don't just go pick up a box of Sudafed. You go to the shelf, and you pick up this card that says Sudafed, and then you have to go behind the counter to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist makes you, like, register. It's federal. It's like, well, I think it's state law. You have to register, you have to show ID, that gets tracked, like all the purchases of Sudafed get tracked, and then you get your Sudafed. And the reason is because pseudoephedrine, which is what Sudafed is one of the primary ingredients used to make meth. And we have this big meth problem, so this is a counter meth measure. So I noticed when I went to buy my Sudafed, next to the Sudafed card was another card for this product called Nexafed. And I'd never heard of Nexafed before, but I noticed that it said it still is made of pseudoephedrine, which is the same active ingredient. But it had this weird tagline, which was battle congestion and meth abuse to join the fight. So I thought, like, well, that's really weird. I don't understand what that means. So I decided to do a little bit of research about Nexafed. So it's a product that's been around for almost 2 years, and it's called bioequivalent to Sudafed. It's the same. It's not like a different ingredient. It's the same exact active ingredient. It's still pseudoephedrine, but the difference is that it's been made meth-proof. And the way they do that is, okay, so if you're going to make meth, I've been doing a lot of research on the internet about this, so I'm sure I'm on like 1,000 lists. One of the primary things you have to do to extract the pseudoephedrine is you crush up the the Sudafed tablet, and then you pour a solution through it, and like chemically that breaks some bonds, and the pseudoephedrine comes out. This solution is like alcohol, or I think you can use lighter fluids and different things. And so what they've done with Nexafed, it's basically like the DRM of pharmaceuticals. What they've done is like make it impossible to do that. And they do that by making them, they're really hard to crush. And then if you do crush them, or if you do like kind of crush them and pour a solution over them, what happens is that they gel up, almost like those monkeys you used to play with when you were little that would like gel up when they got wet, so that you can't extract the pseudoephedrine from them. So that's like the idea of what this is. So I started to think like, okay, I don't understand, maybe it's because I'm sick, but I don't understand this product. Like I don't get who would buy this, right? So in my mind, there were two end users for this type of drug. One is like somebody who wants to make methamphetamine. And I know that Walter White like didn't actually use pseudoephedrine in making his meth on Breaking Bad, but I figured he was like the most recognizable meth maker, so I'm using him as my example. So it's either Walter White or it's just like a legitimately sick person like me. But Walter White doesn't make any sense, right? Because if you want to tamper with the product, you wouldn't buy a tamper-proof product, you'd buy the non-tamper-proof product. And then I thought the sick person doesn't really make sense either in terms of there being a market for this drug, right? Like, it's the same as Sudafed, but it's as expensive or in some cases slightly more expensive. And like, if I'm not tampering with it, the fact that it's tamper-proof seems kind of like irrelevant. It's not obvious why I would buy this as opposed to the thing that I've always bought that I know works for me. So I don't think that there's much of a market for that user either. So I was super confused and I thought like, okay, well there's no reason this product makes sense until you start to think about the end user not as an individual but as part of a networked context. So just to kind of like describe what some of that context might look like, and this is not like an exclusive picture, like let's think about the fact that the person who's sick quite possibly doesn't live like in total social isolation, right? Like maybe that person, for example, has a child. So maybe that person is concerned that like they know they're not going to tamper with the Sudafed to make meth, but maybe they have a kid at home who is going to, right? And so this is almost like a child-proof lock, right? Like those child caps where you can open it but your kid can't. Like that's a possible use case here, right? Another possibility is that this person, so meth is like actually a bit, it's not so much of a problem in New York, it's a big problem in rural areas and small towns. So I'm from Indiana. Indiana is like the meth capital of the world, basically. We're really proud of it. And when I go home to Indiana, I know everybody who works at the pharmacy. They're like people I grew up with. They're people who, even though I haven't lived there for 10 years, like I still know them. Everybody knows everybody in these small towns. So it may be that you're like communicating with this pharmacist that you know when you choose to go behind the counter and purchase this product, right? You might be saying, look, I'm not a meth head. Please don't put me on your watch list, whether that's formal or just like informal gossip. Like know that I'm actually sick, right? Maybe the purchase of the product is serving this kind of communicative function in that case. And we know actually that, well, I'm standing in front of it, but we know that Liz Chiarello has done some really cool work in the last couple of years about pharmacists and how they have seen their role expand from being just medical gatekeepers who kind of oversee drug interactions and stuff with their patient or with their customers to also becoming legal gatekeepers where they're responsible for doing like some criminal justice functions, making sure that people aren't abusing the drugs and there are a lot of reporting requirements on them, that kind of thing. So we could understand that like this might be a real case for the use of a product like Nexifed. So to blow it up a little more, maybe the end user we should think about isn't just the sick person, but the pharmacy itself. And actually, if you look at the marketing materials for Nexifed, a lot of them are oriented actually towards pharmacies because they're looking for pharmacies to decide to stock the product. So one problem that pharmacies often have with respect to pseudoephedrine is that meth addicts go steal it, right, so that they can make more. So you could say that the pharmacy might, try and use this as like insurance against being robbed. Maybe if they stock no Sudafed or less Sudafed and more Nexifed, then they're minimizing their possibility of being targeted for those types of robberies. Another possibility is the regulatory context. So this is Catherine Hamburg. She's the commissioner of the FDA. The FDA, as you all know, regulates what types of drugs can be marketed and or not marketed, but used and in what way. In addition, each state has an independent board of pharmacy that makes decisions about whether drugs have to be prescription or if they're over the counter, or if you have to do this thing like with the card. So currently 2 states have made Sudafed prescription only, Oregon and I think Virginia. But the possibility exists that in the future more states will make Sudafed prescription only, but that Nexifed might not be because it's tamper-proof. So perhaps the existence of Nexifed might make those laws more easier to pass. And in a case like that, you could understand why there would be a market for Nexifed because it would be a way to get the medicine without getting a prescription. And then last one is this communicative interest that pharmacies have to their customers. So I talked about this communicative interest between the sick person and his or her pharmacist, but pharmacies also want to represent themselves in certain ways to their customers. So CVS just did this thing where they stopped selling all tobacco products. They called it CVS Quits for Good, and they did that because they wanted to show the community. It's a PR move, right? They wanted to show that they're really concerned about the health of the communities in which they work. And for meth, this is also super relevant, right? It has really big detrimental effects on communities. So maybe by saying, okay, we are not going to stock this thing, that's a PR move for these pharmacies. So I think if we start thinking about the user in the context of these networks, what happens is that we stop thinking about these isolated individuals, and we start to understand technology use as being about this constellation of power relationships and institutional entanglements, and that those both get mediated through technology use. So that's I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but I like this case because I think it makes this extremely clear. And then from this, I think, follow two more things. The first is that if we see the end user in this context, like we don't just think about the specific material affordances of a technology as being the drivers of use. We also start to see these much broader social motivations matter. So things like gossip, things like mistrust, things like the idea of social shame, right? If you are perceived as a meth user, those are now all shaping the market for this product in these ways that I think we would have missed those if we didn't look at the user broadly. And then finally, I think the other thing to note is that when we understand use this way, contingency really enters the picture in a way that it doesn't otherwise. So if you notice a lot of the things I talked about, the use is premised on what other people might do, right? Like what your child might do, what a robber might do. There's this idea of temporal contingency that enters the picture of technology adoption and use that I think is really important for all tech designers, but it's hard to find if you just look at the isolated use case. Just one final thing is that I think if we start to think about technology used this way, you actually see it pop up in lots of different contexts. So I was just reading about this fertilizer you can buy that's, they neutralize the ammonium nitrate so that it can't be used to make bombs. Totally exactly the same thing, right? Doesn't make any sense. And it's, if you just look at people buying fertilizer, but if you keep in mind that we ship a lot of fertilizer to Pakistan and Afghanistan as part of foreign aid and trade, then it makes sense why there's a market for this type of product. And I think actually Snapchat we can understand in the same way. I think the restriction, nobody understands, old people don't understand Snapchat, right? Because it seems well, why would you want a product that does less than it could, right? That only keeps this image for a few seconds. And I think it's actually sort of a recognition, that use is power, right? And that use, I think the restriction that's placed on this is much like the restriction that's placed on Nexifed in that it's an effort to limit the scope of the information moving through networks. So that's it. I appreciate your time. Thanks.
So hi, I'm Sebastian. I used to build cyber infrastructure for a living. And then I went to grad school because I wanted to theorize the web. So I'm very excited to be here. If there's one thing I wanted to get out of this talk, it's that we can kind of go backwards, right? We can theorize the web, but we can also take our theories of the web and put it back into the design of the web infrastructure itself. And so really, this talk is about the process of taking some values that we might have from our theories, right, and building it into a tool. So I made you a present, and I hope you like it. I put a lot of thought into it. The first three of these kind of cryptic bullet points are the thought I put into this thing I made for you. And that's the first half of this talk. It's about inequality in the public sphere. And the second half is about the thing I made, and how I hope you'll like it, and how if you don't like it, I hope you'll tell me in a way that we can improve on it together. So starting with something like, well, what do we like? We like equality. There's a lot of talk about privilege in this space. References to privilege are often references to inequalities of privilege. That Occupy thing happened. That seemed to be about equality or inequality. But if you want to do something about it, you need a working theory of it. And I'm not expert in social inequality, economic inequality, I'm not a sociologist, but you gotta start somewhere. So here's my theory of inequality. It's that it's really complicated. Right? It's a systemic problem, and there's lots of components to what gives people power and in society, and they reinforce each other. And so you're never going to get a magic bullet, right? But you can shoot bullets. Right? And so you might as well try to take off some part of the problem and work on it. So let's talk about the public sphere. There's a lot of history to this term from a guy, Habermas, who was writing in the 60s. And he's a Marxist, so he tells the Marxist story, right? You've got monarchs, they get overthrown by capitalists. And then he points out, well, okay, the capitalists have to start running society, like you do. And you got to control the markets, and you got to control the government. How do you do that? Well, you get together in coffee shops, and you write newspapers, and you come to rational agreement about how society should go. And that's your public sphere, and it's great. But then, consumerism sets in, and advertising starts to drive the media, and you get media power, right? Which starts controlling the political debate right there. And the way this Habermasian stuff got the U.S. was through a conference where a lot of people got critiqued a lot by, for example, Nancy Fraser. And she said, well, okay, yes, the bourgeois men did that, but what about all the people they excluded, right? Like, what about the women, the people of color, the working class groups? Well, they had to form counter-publics. And they were able to come up with these counter-narratives in politics, but the public sphere is not just one place where everybody is equal. It's really a nexus of multiple publics and counter-publics. 20 years later, we've got networked publics. So we no longer have a nexus of publics. We've got, say, on social media, let's be concrete, we've got Twitter. And it's a social network, and it's mediated by technology. And we still have these inequality issues, just with kind of a more higher resolution system. So social networks, we know now, because we have all this data about what social networks look like, are super uneven. So you might think that, say, number of friends or followers or something is distributed, it's like a bell curve, you know, like there's sort of like a middle range. Not how it works. It's actually super uneven. And you got some people that are sort of celebrities or micro-celebrities, and you got a lot of people that aren't. Right? And this is super robust, like academic co-publications, all kinds of things have this sort of distribution. It's the same distribution roughly as income, just highly unequal. Right? It's a nice, it's small illustration of that. And there's a proposed mechanism for how this works, which is preferential attachment. So that is, say you're new to this network, who are you more likely to connect to? Somebody who already has a lot of influence in the network. Like you're going to follow some celebrity or someone who's well known, not so much somebody else. Repeat that process enough, you get the power law. So Manuel Castells, he's a pretty smart sociologist, and he was saying, well, okay, in network society, power is controlled by these channels of communication, and your position in your network gives you networked power. So logically, unless we start designing things very differently, the networked publics are going to be just as unequal as the other publics. So that means the people with a lot of power in these networks can do agenda setting. You know, they can say what people are talking about in the public sphere. They can reframe things like they want. And the network power winds up succeeding the media power. That's the theory going through. Oh, right. And it's going to reinforce the existing power dynamics, of course, right? Because you're going to pay for followers on Twitter, and then you're going to be perceived as more powerful, and then people. This is the logic. So what can you do about it? Well, you can kind of hack off that piece and say, like, what if we did something different? If we start working on that, then maybe we can affect the whole system with some kind of culture hack. That's my thinking anyway. So Tarleton Gillespie talks about relevance algorithms in a pretty recent paper. That, you know, how much of our lives are determined by these algorithms telling us what's important, who should we follow, what content we should see. You can write algorithms. You can write different algorithms. You can write an irrelevance algorithm if you want. So why not put that into the infrastructure? Molly Saunders, I think she coined the term infrastructure-based activism. I don't know. You could call me an infrastructure-based activist if you like. So yeah, let's do it. How do we design this for parity? Well, if you know the listserv, that's a really cool project that came out of NYU a few years ago. And it's a mailing list where once a day, one subscriber is chosen to email everybody else. And right now it's got about 25,000 members and amazing parity properties. So you can do this just on Twitter too. If you like, you can follow and mention this account now, like I built it last week. And what it does is periodically it'll find everybody that's mentioned it recently and who follows it, and retweet one at random. And so I built it this way because I wanted it to, you want you to be able to lurk. You know, you don't want to have to like always sign up to be retweeted. But if you opt in, then you know you get a chance of being shown off to other people if that's what you like. And right now it's got about like 30 people involved, so no big deal. But I invite you to it. And is this hashtag revolutionary? I don't think so, but it's a proof of concept, and really like an invitation to a kind of praxis. Praxis being a fancy word for doing something about what you're talking about. So if you like it or you don't like it, I really encourage you to talk to me about how we can build features to make it better. And a great way to do that is through GitHub. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's sort of like the networked public where the people that build your networked publics hang out and talk about the stuff they're doing. So say you've got a critique, like your design is based totally on a naive view of network power. You know, you're not taking into account lobbyist dynamics, right? Well, I filed that ticket, and we can talk about how to implement that in like a feature, and then put it into the tweet serve, right? It's also really important to me that people are able to deploy this to their own accounts or separate accounts. Like I'm running this one account, but there's no reason why somebody, you know, with a little savvy could just plug it into their own account. So I need to get the documentation up on that. And then, you know, some kind of exclusion is probably necessary to prevent, you know, communicative violence. Thanks. No problem. So I don't really, you know, you could depend on Twitter's system to do that, or maybe you can build in your own filters. That's a hard problem, but worth noting in the issue tracker. Everything goes. Alvin Chang, one of the people that worked on the original listserv, has already started a thread in the issue tracker, and we're talking about, okay, well, how do you promote like high value content? Because that's something that I didn't put in the original design. So really eager for collaboration with anyone who wants to get involved, because that's my background. It's open source software development. So please fork it. That means like make a copy, make changes, submit patches back. I'll keep updating this service. And thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions.
So I'll pull this up. I made the mistake of trying to convert a 40-page paper into 15 minutes. So I'm going to read what I want to say to you so that I can get everything in 15 minutes and not get yelled at by the moderator.
I'm literally going to risk laptop away from me.
I've timed it, so hopefully we're good. All right. On December 10, 2011, Jack Werner became the first of 123 people to curate the official account for Sweden. Every week, control of the @Sweden account is given to a Swedish citizen to say anything, as long as it is predominantly in English, without censorship or limits. The Swedish Institute and Visit Sweden, the governmental agencies that run the project, and Volunteer, the marketing company that created it, intended the project to promote Sweden by representing the country through the complex mix of skills, experiences, and opinions it actually consists of, in order to create an interest in Sweden's culture, business, and people. Over the course of the last 123 weeks, the list of curators has included Swedish citizens living across Sweden and abroad, and has included indigenous Sami, natural citizens, and immigrants from Bosnia, Brazil, Finland, Germany, Hong Kong, Iraq, Poland, United States, and Turkey. There have been marketers, designers, programmers, journalists, photographers, writers, sheep farmers, reindeer herders, naked naturalists, sexologists, etc. From launching the award-winning most democratic Twitter account in the world to starting a worldwide trend of rotation curation, the Curators of Sweden has complicated how to think about nation branding and governmental use of social media. However, the literature on the Curators of Sweden has focused only on a superficial analysis of the project's innovation, radicalism, and absurdity, resulting in a thin description of the project. The academic literature on the Curators of Sweden is quite small. However, the trends in this literature that I find problematic extend to the much larger literature of digital anthropology in general. I have found the Academy to be largely infatuated with the user and dismissive of the Internet's designers, developers, and creatives, except when those creators fit into categories of traditional anthropological interest, such as hackers and free software movement. Hardware designers, software designers, web developers, graphic designers, and marketing directors are largely lost amid the cacophony of user narratives. Relying only on user accounts and personal experiences can lead to erroneous conclusions. For example, Tom Belstorff asserted in 2012 that there is no technological reason Twitter could not have existed in 1996, and that the only limiting factor was that developers were unable to imagine it. Relying only on his experience as a user of the simplistic client-side interface, he was blind to the complex systems that are required to make Twitter work on the server side, including server-side scripting, relational databases, and powerful server hardware, which certainly did not exist in 1996. I suggest that we abandon our faith in user omnipotence and remove the user from the savage slot of the anthropology of the internet to open up space in ethnography for engaging the internet's creatives in this project. I have included documentation from IT and marketing teams of Volunteer, Visit Sweden, and the Swedish Institute into my ethnographic text to create more holistic conclusions about my project. This allows me to engage the curators of Sweden beyond what it is like to be a user who reacts to the curators' insightful and sometimes absurd tweets. The concepts of online and offline have taken on a privileged position within digital anthropology. I have found that this distinction is of little importance to most users and technology professionals. The actual experience of the internet involves many states of being, which are constituted of digital, non-digital, and hybrid experiences, and that have little connection to the simplistic binary of online and offline. The issue is not whether the online or offline boundary is clear, indexical, disappearing, or blurred. The issue is that the online does not exist in this way. They are useful heuristic terms for thinking and talking about human behavior in relation to technology, but they should not be the foregrounded focus of ethnographic studies. I've attempted to diminish the emphasis on what is online and what is offline in this study. I seek to instead foreground what the project is, what it is doing, and how people involved are pulled together through projects, goals, and individual play. This allows me to engage things that are online and offline, as well as historical aspects that precede the existence of online, without getting tangled in this problematic boundary. The Curators of Sweden is one small section of a greater project of Swedish nation branding, and is rooted in the longer history of Swedish modernism generally. The National Romantic movement in Sweden during the late 19th century through the 1920s was influential in the development of Swedish modernism, particularly through the linkage of beauty, the home, and social justice. Carl Larsson's popular 1899 Et Hem, A Home, depicted in vibrant colors Larsson's home, creating an aesthetic of beauty that was rooted in the home, intimacy, and private spaces that was at the center of the Swedish National Romantic movement. During this period, the social justice connection to beauty and home was cemented by Ellen Key's Beauty for Everyone. He argued that better living conditions was equality could be achieved through the creation of beautiful objects, meaning simple and easy to use in addition to aesthetics, that were affordable and accessible to anyone. From this milieu, the Social Democrats were formed and by the 1920s had gained power in the parliament as the party of the people. The Social Democrats embraced the narratives of the period and defined the platform with the label Folkhem, meaning the people's home, which became part of the platform that established the Swedish social welfare system. Swedish modernism as a design aesthetic developed alongside the welfare state. Although the Social Democratic Party has lost some of its power and influence in Sweden's government, the basic underlying principles have been maintained and appear embedded in many of the government's projects. This is most easily seen in the promotion of Sweden's brand, or national brand, and Swedish design. Svensk Form, the world's oldest design publication, was founded in 1845 as mandated by the Swedish government to safeguard the quality of the Swedish craft industry. At the time of Svensk Form's establishment, the rise of mass-produced, poor-quality products were seen as threatening the guild-trained craftsman industry. By 1919, the narratives of early Swedish modernism had taken hold and shaped the mission of Svensk Form, which that year took up the slogan, "Beautiful Everyday Goods." Svensk Form encouraged new approaches to design that embraced industrial mass production, rather than fought it, to bring Key's vision of beauty for everyone to fruition. Today, Svensk Form features high-fashion clothing alongside household items like tape dispensers as examples of beauty in Swedish design, and figures prominently in Swedish nation branding alongside projects like the Curators of Sweden. The Curators of Sweden embody Swedish modernism in its content, design, and implementation, seamlessly incorporating the tropes beauty, home, and everyone. Twitter is not a Swedish invention, and it was not made for the curators of Sweden. In some ways, Twitter is particularly ill-suited for rotation curation. Yet Twitter is beautiful in the Swedish sense. It is simple, functional, and free to anyone, with an internet connection, that is. The technology that keeps Twitter running, however, is substantial, requiring extensive development labor. In 2013, Bloomberg reported that Twitter had grown to 2,300 employees from just 8 employees in 2008. The feat of organizing the human and technological labor behind Twitter to produce the simple Twitter interface is not accidental. Twitter's mission is to give everyone the power to create and share ideas and information instantly without barriers. Twitter's compatibility with Swedish beauty was not missed by the curators of Sweden's creators. In explaining why Twitter was chosen, they described Twitter with a strong emphasis on simplicity, ease of use, accessibility, and free access. In addition to the beauty of Twitter's platform, the curators of Sweden incorporate the cultural geometry of Swedish beauty into its visual identity. The project's logo uses a sans serif grotesque typeface consisting of straight lines, gentle curves, and a consistent stroke without embellishment. The graphic elements of the logo consist of just 2 right angles and a straight line. Both the project's website and Twitter profile are austere. It is unlikely, given Volontair's design experience, that this was accidental. Rather, the project's visual identity was carefully crafted to fit within the larger brand of Swedish beauty. Each curator is given guidelines on what to do with the account. The first states, "We want you to be yourself, nothing else." That is, do what you normally do. Tweets will not be censored as long as they do not break the law or are for financial personal gain. By the design, the project aims to make Swedish life familiar to non-Swedes, arguing that Swedish political objectives, trade investments, visitors, exchange of talent, and creativity are all heavily dependent on the view of the outside world. Thus, it is unsurprising to find the home and everyday life featured prominently in the tweets of curators. Volontair's promotional video for the project imagined curators sharing traditional food, taste, and music or cinema, or inviting readers to come with them for a typical day at work. Accordingly, curators use the account not just as a platform from which to speak, but also as a documentation of their life. The everyday was present in the live tweeting of curators' activities, such as meals, work, and visiting friends. Using Twitter's photo embedding features, curators shared the intimate settings of their families and homes. Many of the parents posted images of their children and discussed child-rearing practices. Curators also tweeted frequently about Swedish laws and customs that made family in the home center of Swedish life, frequently contrasting them with United States business-centric culture. Every week, someone in Sweden is at Sweden, the sole ruler of the world's most democratic Twitter account. The project's marketing materials consistently use the word democratic to describe the project and the government's motivation. Press coverage of the project also consistently describes it as democratic. Additionally, the project has used curators as signifiers for diversity by carefully choosing curators of diverse backgrounds. However, the criteria to become a curator is steeper and less representative than it might seem. To become a curator, one must be a Swedish citizen, an interesting and prolific tweeter, able to write engagingly in English for 7 days, and be nominated by someone else. These criteria seem like low barriers, considering that the Twitter platform is free, English is spoken by 86% of the population, and the country's internet penetration stands at 90.6. However, the criteria to become a curator makes the potential pool of applicants only 0.5% of the country's population.
How far over I'm going on each slide.
The canonical time's over here, though.
Well, I gotta, don't distract me, I gotta get on it. So the title of this is Successor Systems, Enacting Ideological Critique through the Development of Software. My name is Stuart Geiger. I'm a PhD student at the UC Berkeley School of Information, also where Seb is at. And I want to talk to you today about this concept that I've been sort of coming up with in collaboration with a lot of activist projects that I've been working on, particularly those in Wikipedia, in trying to fix a lot of the problems that are often very well publicized about the health of the community, the demographic makeup of the people who edit Wikipedia, and sort of what happens when newcomers come in and try to make changes without knowing without having read the freaking manual. And I want to introduce this concept not as something that I think that everyone should be doing all the time, but instead
talk about it as a sort of a synthesizing concept, something that is that's been very useful for me and my collaborators in calling our attention to particular issues of power, of inequality, of design, and how you sort of work with all of those together. So the itinerary, what I'm going to be sort of taking you through today, is I'm going to first talk about sort of what is a successor system and what is a successor science. This term of successor systems is something that's coming out of concepts from sort of late 80s, early 90s, sort of feminist philosophy of science. And I think I want to argue that there's sort of a very strong link, and there's a very high, there's a lot of connections and relevance of that existing literature as it applies to study systems of knowledge production that we can take in studying and building systems of computational production today. And the biggest of these is what I'm going to be talking about is this idea of standpoints and partial perspectives. I'm going to give you 3 cases of activist systems, one of which is a system that I helped work on in Wikipedia, and 2 were projects that were completely outside of Wikipedia, but were very important and useful in helping us understand our own relation to issues of critique and power and design. And then I want to sort of talk about talk about them each as kinds of successor systems, and then talk about implications and further questions. So broadly, generally, in successor systems projects, there are 3 things that I sort of found in comparing the work that we were doing with work that other activist projects were doing using computational systems. One of the things that I saw is that there's some sort of existing, often dominant system of knowledge production, which is sometimes but not necessarily software-based. We can see that in, for example, in Seb's project with the TweetServe bot, the idea that there are certain kinds of logics that come into a network public that say this is that sort of define what is relevant for you. And 2, there are standpoints or kinds of accounts that this existing system does not sufficiently incorporate or represent. One of the projects that I'll be talking about is a project called Hollaback, which is a project that critiques the institutional ignorance of street harassment. And one of the projects is that there's systems where people could go and report incidents of street harassment on a map, whereas then in that kind of perspective, that kind of standpoint, was not something that was typically represented in things like crime maps or media narratives about sort of urban life. And so 3rd, there is a project that seeks to build better accounts of the world that better support alternative standpoints and perspectives. And I really like the conversation about users and design because I think that a successor systems approach is something that goes beyond just simply finding an unmet need, finding an unmet set of individuals who are trying to do something and doing good for the world. It's something that really hinges on this idea of the standpoint and the partial perspective and what it means to do that. And so successor systems as a concept calls attention also to the way in which computational systems are also systems of knowledge production. And it's something that my work has sort of been continually looking at in a variety of different contexts. But I wanted to argue that we can learn many lessons from the science wars of the late 80s and early 90s, something that as someone with a philosophy of science background, I care a lot about and I'm very interested about. But only recently I sort of realized that these have strong applications to a lot of issues that are going on today in contemporary social media platforms. Things like Twitter or Wikipedia or a number of other things that we've been talking about. So we have to go back to the 1980s to sort of talk about this and sort of to set the stage of what was going on in that. And there was all these debates that were going back and forth about sort of, is science really objective or is it merely subjective? And you had these people sort of going back and forth, and you had particularly 2 theorists, Sandra and Donna Haraway, sort of talk about the way that sort of object and subject are mutually constitutive of each other. You can't have an objective and a subjective position without each other. And one of the things that they wanted to talk about in these 2 texts is this idea of the successor science. And this is, I put the full citations because they're both great. In particular, Donna Haraway's article on situated knowledges is sort of one of my favorite articles that I keep going back to, and I keep finding all these great gems about how to design technology that are very relevant even today, sort of decades later. And so what they talk about in this understanding of situated knowledges is this idea that the partial perspective might actually have a privilege to it. That science often describes itself as a detached view of the world, or the rhetoric of science is often that it is a sort of view from nowhere, that it has a perspective, that has also what's called sort of a God's eye view. But one of the things that Haraway in particular in her work in primatology was very interested in was how people who were often systematically excluded from science, when they came into scientific practice, looked at the world a different way, looked at the same data a different way. And so one of the things that they talk about in the field of primatology, for example, is how when women enter the field, they start to see things beyond sort of primal relations between alpha males who are competing for resources. They don't say that literature, all of that work that was done by people who mostly look like me in the early 1940s and 50s was necessarily wrong, but they come in and people who with different perspectives, different standpoints, make visible different kinds of issues and build a new kind of science and primatology around that. And that's what Haraway and Harding call this idea of the successor science. It's not something that necessarily seeks to deconstruct science and as something that is sort of merely subjective and therefore something we shouldn't pay attention to, but to understand how subjectivity and objectivity are necessarily linked, and that building better kinds of science can be part of the feminist project. And so Harding and Haraway in particular were concerned with issues of power, but issues of power as how knowledge produced from certain standpoints becomes totalizing, and seeing if it was produced from no standpoint at all. And they advocated multiple standpoints and multiple sciences, multiple that they say blend objectivity with situatedness. And they warned against the critical deconstruction of science as merely subjective. And there's this great quote that I have from them where they say that feminists have to insist on a better account of the world. It's not enough to show radical historical contingency and modes of construction for everything. Despite the fact that both Harding and Haraway were deeply committed to showing the radical historical contingency of forms of knowledge production like science, what they said is that once we do that, we have to go farther. And we have to do something, we have to insist on a better account of the world. And so this is a quote from Haraway where she talks about how feminists have states in a successor science that offers a more adequate, richer, broader account of the world in order to live in it well. She has this, and I'll come back to the rest of the quote in a little bit, but she ends this quote by talking about how in traditional philosophical categories, the issue is ethics and politics, perhaps more than epistemology or truth. Now, this is a controversial statement to make about science, and I want to flip it on its head when we talk about technology. Because it seems quite logical in our sense to talk about, okay, technological systems, there's ethics and politics around it. We don't normally think about issues of epistemology or truth when it comes to a computational system. We often focus on one of these and not the other. And so I want to say, so in the same way that Haraway and Harding were talking about how we need to think about ethics and politics in epistemology in science, we also need to think about epistemology when it comes to the ethics and politics of technological systems. And I'll give some more if you're a little confused right now, I understand this is like this is sort of post-structuralist feminist theory that I want to make very concrete by discussing some examples. So 2 examples that I want to give of what this kind of project means. One is a project called Turkopticon. And this was a project that was critiquing the inequalities in Amazon's Mechanical Turk crowdsourcing system. This is a system where you can go out and sort of farm out a task, split it up into tiny chunks, and pay people 5 cents to sort of transcribe an image or write a review or do something and then put it all together. And one of the things that sort of Irani and Silberman, who were researchers who studied this and published in the proceedings of the Chi conference last year, talk about how there were massive structural inequalities at work. There was rampant exploitation, particularly because they argued that there was this panopticon inside of Amazon Mechanical Turk. Like Bentham's panopticon that Foucault describes, there was a system of surveillance in which employers knew so much about workers, and workers knew absolutely nothing about employers. So workers were situated all these kinds of knowledge practices where employers knew exactly how efficient they were, how well they were, how long they had been, how trustworthy they were. But workers often did not understand sort of whether they could trust their employers. And employers would systematically sort of lie about how long they estimated a task would take. They would sometimes just not pay or be very late in delaying. And so what Irani and Silberman did was develop a browser extension called Turkopticon that let workers in Mechanical Turk rate their employers in the same way that Amazon had already built in a similar feature for employers to rank workers. And so anytime with this browser extension, a Turk worker goes on Mechanical Turk and tries to see which jobs they want to apply, they want to get, they see a reputation system that mirrors back the same kinds of power relations that Amazon has already privileged when it comes to the employer's view of the worker. A second system that is an accurate system and also serves as an inspiration for projects we're doing in Wikipedia was this project of Hollaback, which I talked about before, which is a project that was sort of led by Jill Diamond. This was published in the proceedings of the CSCW conference last year as well, that was critiquing the systematic institutional ignorance of street harassment across societies. And it's something where actually standpoint becomes a very interesting and important thing that I want to talk about, because as someone who is from the many different categories of identity that I come from, I actually don't have the same kind of understanding of what street harassment means and what it is. And in particular, this was part of their argument, that street harassment is something that particular women and minorities are told to ignore. They're told that it's not an issue that is relevant in either sort of the news media or the police. And a lot of times they had these stories about people who would sort of call the police whenever they were harassed and told the police would sort of laugh in their faces as well. And so what they decided to do was to create a system that would let people who had faced street harassment represent that in a technological space and assemble around a project of documenting incidents of street harassment. This is a case of, this is New York City, and I remember when I looked at this and I opened up a browser and sort of saw all these incidents. Each of these is an incident of street harassment, and then if you click it, you get a little narrative about what happened. I remember being absolutely horrified that someone who comes from my subject position has absolutely no idea that sort of the rampant street harassment that would take place sometimes in spaces that I interact with on a daily basis. And so I think it was very important, and this particular project is one that's now in, I believe, over 80 different cities. It's spawned a social movement. It's something that also, like Churchopticon, there's been a network public that has assembled around the production of knowledge about this. So the ethics, so issues of ethics and issues of power are tightly linked here to issues of epistemology, to the production of knowledge. These systems don't just sort of seek to make the world a better place, but they seek to make new standpoints possible. And they seek to make different kinds of projects, not just projects of making the world a better place, but building better accounts of the world. In this sense, this is actually a very terrifying account of the world, but it's better in the sense that it makes visible certain kinds of things that were previously made invisible. And so these two projects are projects that we really took as inspiration when we were thinking about the kinds of problems that newcomers face when they enter Wikipedia. And this is a project that was an intervention against a system called Huggle in Wikipedia. And Huggle was an automated tool that was designed to find bad editors in Wikipedia, to remove damaging content and deter future damage. And it casts newbies as inherently suspicious. And we did a lot of research with the people who were Wikipedia's gatekeepers, and we found that there was a whole bunch of problems with how they saw new editors through this lens. And so they didn't see them as, they saw sort of good faith mistakes as damage to be removed, and they sent these nasty warnings. These were often highly automated as well. We found that actually 75% of the users would receive their first message from one of these sort of nasty gatekeeping systems, turning a lot of people off. And so we designed a project that was called Snuggle Don't Huggle, and this became actually sort of a catchphrase in the Wikipedian community. It was an automated tool to find good editors for Wikipedia, to acknowledge their contributions and to mentor and support them. And so it casts bad edits as mistakes rather than damage. So this is an example of the Huggle tool. We can see like a before and after. You basically press this red button to remove the edit forever from Wikipedia and to send someone a nasty message. And instead we had this system. It's a very sort of technological system because it's designed for Wikipedians who are often power users, but you see a holistic view of the editor. You see a holistic view of someone who comes in, and there's a whole bunch of machine learning algorithms that we work very hard on to try to figure out exactly what is the utility of predicting someone's future work and then balancing that with the idea that, well, maybe someone's past edits aren't necessarily indicative of their future performance. Maybe that we can have some sort of system that can intervene strategically, some sort of system where we can produce different kinds of knowledge that are useful for mentoring as opposed to simply quality control. So to go back to these sort of three systems of success systems, there's in each of these projects, there's an existing, often dominant system of knowledge production that sort of we want to critique. There are standpoints of these accounts that it does not represent. In this particular case with Snuggle, it was that of mentoring. And then there's a project to build better accounts of the world. And I think that the important thing, and I'm about to run out of time now, is that, so I'll skip forward to this final slide about questions that I'm still asking about how do you know a successor system is successful? How do you know? And the three things that I think are important that have been important for us is that across these systems, there's an issue about making the assumptions built into the dominant system visible. So to outline that as a form of critique, which critical theory has done for quite some time. But there's also a way that these sort of successor systems, these alternative systems, denaturalize the dominant system, make it be seen as one of many ways of seeing the world, as opposed to rather the only possible way that's taken as default. That was sort of the problem we had about seeing newcomers in Wikipedia as inherently suspicious, and we wanted to open that up. And then three, this is something that we've sort of also been striving for with the Snuggle project, is that we want to sort of help a public assemble in the production of these more situated knowledges. Something that's sort of not just something going to fix the world with a technological change, but provide something for people to rally around. Thank you.
I'd say theorizing the web is off to a great start. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to wield my unequal influence in this room by making a quick short statement to open the discussion, because just to tie some of the threads together, my role as moderator. But I think like we can, the session opened with this interesting provocation that systems are not designed for those we think of as users, but to serve the interests of other entities. In other words, they have no neutrality. And I think that was, in a way, a common thread throughout. We had here, in Karen's paper, we had the pill, the Nexafed, serving the interest of the law enforcement as well as the interest of the sick. We had the interest, or Karen at Sweden serves the interest not of the end user, the people in the way that it seems, but of promoting Sweden. And then in Sebastian's paper, we had a sense that Twitter doesn't necessarily serve the purpose of like egalitarian discussion, but actually reinforces structural inequalities, and he had a very specific proposal for how one might start to upend those structural inequalities by kind of hacking the system. You should all join that, because the earlier you join, the more influence you get in the system as an early adopter. I noticed today that Ian Bogo's was retweeting, and I was like, hey, come on, the existing hierarchy of Twitter is already in effect. So anyway, we have to like get in there and mess with that. And then a really interesting conclusion from Stuart, who brought in this question of the successor system. And I think, to go back to something that Angela said about needing to remove the user from analysis, in a way, I think the successor system has the opposite implication, which is that we need to kind of be users, and we need to be implicated in these systems as we are thinking of other possible features for them. It reminded me, the rhetoric of what you were saying reminded me of Jesse Burns' idea of the user militia, which is the idea that as a user, you're kind of like, you have to have solidarity with other boneheads on the internet, happen that way. And I thought, like, interestingly, that the first project you showed of it was on Mechanical Turk, but it kind of wasn't that. It was like an imposed design, which I'm not sure if people are using, like, which contrasts with like Chris Marker's approach of like going to the factory, installing a foam corruptor in the factory, and then it becomes like a more kind of intervention potentially. Anyway, so I thought that was like a really interesting big thread for this panel. And at that point, I'm going to open it up to you for responses, or to the audience for questions. We have one here in the center.
I have two questions. It's a great panel. Really looking forward to this, things that are going to come over the next few days. It's going to resonate very well with my panel tomorrow on infrastructures, so come do that. I have two questions, one for Karen and one for Angela. I'm Flash Crocker from Stanford. There's a really interesting story about, you're talking about technological fixes that sort of arise from particular conditions, and then bubble up and create and reconfigure those sort of network conditions. And I'm interested in how you sort of made a loose analogy to DRM. And DRM doesn't mean that you can't actually shape music. And I'm wondering what's the effect of sort of adding this technological layer that then maybe reconfigures the network and pushes people to sort of, I guess, less visible networks. And the second question I had is for Angela, which is really interested in this concept of how, I think one of the larger questions is how an individual rights to free speech situated in a particular location gets funneled through sort of a semi-governmental agency that is then hosted on a platform that is in fact, says that it trumps free speech, but in fact has all sorts of terms and services that, in the Yahoo case, in sort of free speech or hate speech in France is a good example of analogy. So I'm wondering, like, it's sort of a very nebulous question, but how is that conception of free speech moderated through this suite?
Okay, so the first question is about DRM. Do you want to reframe the question? Because I didn't quite understand it.
Okay, I feel like I get it. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So I think the question is about how is it that these sort of technological means of regulation have maybe not unanticipated effects, but how do people resist them or try and reconfigure or something? And the answer is, so actually with respect to Nexafed, there is a meth production technique that has gained some traction, which actually allows you to sort of circumvent the technology and still make meth from Nexafed. It's called the shake and bake method, in case anyone's interested.
You know a lot about meth.
I know a lot more about meth than 2 years ago. Which I don't know actually that has arisen so much in response to. I think it's also like there are other things just sort of cheaper, for example, more time. But you're right that like I feel like there's almost always an arms race between like immediate technological control and then people coming up with interesting and creative hacks for that.
Which I think is interesting because that those people who use that method are sort of now participating publicly and saying, hey, look, I'm actually a good part of this network, but I'm actually taking it.
Right. So I think I'll stop with this slide. It's just that, I mean, like Madeline Eckridge writes a lot about like the idea that we can't script users, right? Like users take a thing and do all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's examples for the telephone, with the car, like going back to the history for all technologies, like how people like use things in ways that maybe we didn't design them for. And I think that is much clearer.
But I think the question does become particularly interesting in relation to that student because you're kind of interested in the same dynamic with that student. But in a way, like your argument, I think, is that like that student is like is inherently about accommodating difference. And therefore by trying to undermine it, you're kind of reinforcing that. Exactly. I mean, I don't know how we would undermine it.
Yeah. I think one of the parts for me that's really important to talk about with the way you're describing how it's very complicated to talk about democracy and openness and freedom and all these things with technologies and government marketing programs. And I think the biggest point for me to get across through a presentation today was that when there's this group of digital anthropologists who are so focused on the user that they completely forget all the other stuff. So unless we start engaging with the developers, the creatives, the marketing directors in these projects, not just in the creators of students and creators, but also in people who create Twitter and their terms of service and things like that, we're going to miss all this complexity and how these things actually occur. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, great.
Anyone else or on Twitter has any questions? Those are just thoughts. We have a question there.
Roger, can you talk about the success of a project? Is it welcoming people more as a community to it all?
And so one of the things that I think has been interesting about that is that there's a core group of mentors, but mentors are sort of not, most Wikipedians aren't mentors, and so the user group is very small. What I think is kind of not more interesting, but at least we're hoping to sort of do beyond that is having it be something that's in the broader conversations that Wikipedians are having. And that's sort of why I'm interested in this idea about sort of having a network of public symbols in relation to it. Because I feel like there's one thing to sort of design something for mentors and to say, well, this is an unmet need and we need to meet this need for the 50 Wikipedians who decide to sort of be nice versus the you know. And it's another sort of say that there's something about viewing newcomers from a lens of suspiciousness that is something that people who are like beyond what it means to sort of take on the role of a mentor is something that I think a lot more Wikipedians we're trying to get them to recognize. And so I think that sort of the Snuggle Project has been pretty successful in filling the unmet needs of the small mentoring cores. But that's one of the things that I think we're struggling with is to how to get it to be something more than that. And that's
I think it supports your narrative of situated knowledges because it's not just the system, but it's also like there's a participation around it, which is what's creating the change. I don't know.
One of the cool things that we've seen, and this has actually changed the design of the system, is that there's been a number of sort of other projects that have come along newcomer participation in Wikipedia. One's like called the Tea House that was launched, where it was supposed to be a sort of safe space for newcomers to come in and sort of ask stupid questions without feeling like somebody would like yell at them or sort of delete what they're saying or ban them, which happens a lot. And so one of the things that we saw happen is those two projects came linked, and sort of so there was a so Aaron Haffer, who is the lead designer and developer in Snuggle, ended up adding a flow chart, a feature in Snuggle to send people to the Tea House, so that mentors could say, oh, well, I can't deal with this person right now, but maybe there's somebody else who can. So I think that's sort of like that network effect is something that we're excited about.
Yeah.
Question for Angela. Do you have more information, sorry if you talked about it, maybe I could miss it, but do you have more information about how they managed to give the access to this account to the Swedish people and without trouble?
A technical question about how the account is actually given from one person to another.
So I have a few friends who are here.
And basically, it's all done over email. So through the selection process, they send an email. They say, here's the login information. Here are a couple of guidelines, most of which just say don't do anything illegal and don't try to sell things. And then that's it. And then at the end, they change the password and go to that.
We have time for probably just one or two more. We've already got one.
I'd like to ask Stuart how far you can think this snuggle, like you can go, because I mean this works inside one language of Wikipedia. Is that correct? So they're also in between, because the different languages are also fed by different cultures, and there are cultural disputes in the different languages, which I just know briefly from the Wikidata project, which has then very different data depending from what language or from what cultural source the data was put in. And there is used this system that there's every data has assigned to it who contributed it, and it is seen like, yeah, this might be true, this might be true, let's just be friends, something like this. It tries to be, it tries to be not one source of truth. And how you see this in relation to what to snuggling. I mean,
so just
because
to,
there's
just to rephrase,
yeah.
As we're running out of time. I think the question is that how can this redesign of the Wikipedia system ever be truly successful? Because in the end, there's only one piece of knowledge produced. In the end.
Yeah. In the end, it's like, I mean, it's supposed to be this neutral point of view, but yeah, it's neutral always in a certain border.
Right, well I think that's one of the big problems that happens when it comes to sort of people who enter Wikipedia, and even veterans and sort of like long-standing members of the community sort of go back and forth and have these awful, like very long drawn-out arguments about this. And so I don't see about the multilingual issue. Actually, it's been sort of, Erin's done a great job of sort of accommodating sort of requests from people who want to translate it into that, so it's actually existing, I think, about a dozen different language versions now. But one of the things is that, yeah, it's an entirely different system, and each sort of different language version has their own norms about sort of even what it means. And there's a great project called the Omnipedia that actually you can view through Google Translate like different language versions of Wikipedia articles, and you see some pretty striking differences, especially when it comes to like politically relevant topics. So I think actually there's far more difference between the different language versions of Wikipedia than especially when it comes to especially like sort of regional conflicts and regional languages like English. So and there's conflicts there, so it's definitely something to keep looking on and keep working on.
So there are other ways that multiplicity might be enacted.
Yeah.
Sure. But I'm going to draw to a close there, which is, I know there are other questions, but the good news is you have a little bit of time before the next panel, so the conversation can continue. Thank you very much for being here.